Oh, so this is the final video for the class, and it's the exam review. I hope that you have enjoyed the class, Racialization and Society. And the exam is going to be in two sections, and it will be short answer. The first section of the exam is a short answer section where you're asked to define a series of concepts, and it will be the same as the take-home test. It will be the same format. The second section is the essay section. And the essay section will ask you to construct an original thesis and discuss one of the themes in the class. So in the short answer section, you are asked to give a more specific answer or definition of a term like disidentification, fungibility, and you're asked to give a succinct answer in a paragraph format. And it's the exact same format as the take-home test. So in the second section, you are then asked to answer an essay. So I will share my screen, and there's a PowerPoint for our review. So the first section, you will be asked to define 4 out of 7 of the following concepts. Please write at least one paragraph for each definition. Disidentification for the minority subject is a mode of recycling or reforming an object that has already been invested with powerful energy. So in this book, Disidentification, Queers of Color and the Politics and the Performance of Politics, Jose Munoz draws on Michel Pouchot. So the French linguist Michel Pouchot extrapolated a theory of disidentification from Marxist theorist Louis Althusser's influential theory of subject formation and interpolation. So Louis Althusser's essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, is a very well-cited Marxist essay. And in Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, Althusser discussed the process in which subject formation is happens, and subject formation for Louis Althusser is inextricable from state power. So the subject is walking, and the police officer hails them into being by saying, hey, you," and the subject turns around. And this turning for Althusser is the moment in which the subject becomes interpolated as someone who can be stopped by the police, as someone who is subject to state authority. For Althusser, ideology is an inescapable realm in which subjects are called into being or hailed, a process he calls interpolation. Ideology is the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. The location of ideology is always within an apparatus and its practice or practices, such as a state apparatus. So if I'm on the street and someone is, say, cheering for the World Cup, I don't turn around. If I'm on the street and someone is, say, screaming, I don't turn around. If I'm on the street and say someone sexually harasses me, I don't turn around. And so if someone has been called a police officer and interpolated into being as a police officer, given a title, and is an agent of the state, we must turn around. And this is how we are part of state apparatus. And so Althusser in the essay argues, though, that there are times and instances where people don't turn around. And this is where interpolation really is interesting for Althusser. How do we know that we must be subject to state power? How are we taught? And are there other instances when we know that we must be called into being? And so Althusser's essay is important for Munoz because of the names that we are called. We are called gendered names like girl or boy. We are called racial names. And so how do we know that people can interpolate us? Who has given these people power and state authority to interpolate us, to call us names? So Michel Foucault built on this theory by describing the three modes in which a subject is constructed by ideological practices. In this schema, the first mode is understood as identification, where a good subject chooses the path of identification with discursive and ideological forms. So a good subject, say, is called a woman, and they're kind of good in the sense that they are interpolated into this social order. And when one is interpolated, they support state power, so that if you are called a woman, you would identify with, say, the title woman and all of the kind of norms that come with being, say, a good woman. And if you are a good woman, you will be rewarded by patriarchy, by society, by media images. You will be rewarded because you will not, I guess, trouble the ways that patriarchy and sexism and heterosexism often diminish women's capacity to be competitive against others in a capitalist marketplace, or diminish women's capacity to do things that are not gendered in nature. So we've also discussed Judith Butler, and Judith Butler argues that gender is constructed and it is performative in nature. And the gender binary is not an equal binary. Women are often perceived of as weaker than men. So when someone is interpolated then or identifies with a good subject, they choose this path of identification with discursive and ideological forms. They identify with dominant patriarchal ideology or dominant, say, ruling class ideology. Bad subjects, for Foucault, resist and attempt to reject the images and identificatory sites offered by dominant ideology and proceed to rebel, to counter-identify, and turn against this symbolic system. So if someone does not identify, they rebel, say, against gendered norms. They rebel against sexism. They rebel against classism, and they can rebel against state power. The danger that Foucault sees in such an operation would be the counter-determination that such a system installs a structure that validates the dominant ideology by reinforcing its dominance through the controlled symmetry of counter-determination. So even when we counter-identify, we still are kind of worked upon or informed by this dominant system. So even in resisting these norms, we still make reference to them. Disidentification is a third mode of dealing with dominant ideology, one that neither opts to assimilate within such a structure nor strictly opposes it. Rather, disidentification is a strategy that works on and against dominant ideology. So rather than wholly identifying with a good subject or rebelling against this kind of authoritative framework, disidentification works on and against. So instead of buckling under the pressures of dominant ideology, identification and assimilation, or attempting to break free of its inescapable sphere, counter-identification utopianism, this working on and against is a strategy that tries to transform a cultural logic from within, always laboring to enact permanent everyday structural changes, while at the same time valuing the importance of local or everyday struggles of resistance. So rather than spending one's life, say, fighting against a system or wholly kind of being co-opted by or submerged within a system, say state power, disidentification is this third mode where people often work on and against, say, a certain cultural logic, or work on and against and within institutions while always laboring for long-term structural change. So another concept from the course is from Hartman's work, and it is fungibility. So Hartman discusses the transatlantic slave trade and the ways that Blackness was constructed in the slave trade. And the term that Hartman uses is fungibility to discuss the ways that Black bodies in the slave trade were constructed as fungible commodities. Hartman has argued that the transatlantic slave trade constructed a notion of Blackness that is fungible and criminal, making Blackness permanently available for the full enjoyment of white people and making Black people always already guilty in the eyes of the law, incapable of being violated. The civil and social death of Black people forms the basis on which white life and citizenship becomes knowable, their compass and their shadow. Whiteness must be constantly yoked to the future and victimhood, while Blackness must be yoked to death and pathology. The story of endangered white futurity and dangerous Black negativity, the sexual politics that motors anti-Blackness can be found on every channel. Hartman cites Lauren Berlant, who has exposed how the celebrated Lauren Berlant has exposed how the celebrated figure of the feminized white child, sometimes I stutter, at risk of violence in the post-Reagan years has been mobilized to justify claims to state protection and citizenship. The celebrated figure of a feminized white child at risk of racialized violence in the post-Reagan years has been mobilized to justify claims to state protection and citizenship. So this kind of story of endangered white futures and Black negativity is, for Hartman, a remnant of slavery. And this idea of a commodity that can be used for every purpose is what Hartman discusses in the essay from the syllabus, that Blackness is used for every purpose of enjoyment, but also to support white victimization, stories of fear. So the idea of whiteness as being always under threat, in danger, in need of salvation, and in need of more and more kind of support is also a way that Blackness becomes used, in the way that a commodity that is fungible can be moved. And the movability is also about the movement of Black people during the transatlantic slave trade, and also the movement of people who are evicted from their homes, who must move constantly for work. So Hartman and other critical race theorists also discuss laws and legality. Legal equality arguments require those making them both to articulate existing legal structures as generally fair and neutral, but for the exclusion, focused on and to portray the excluded group as a population that deserves inclusion. This work constructs desirable and undesirable populations, those deserving a chance at life and reproduction, and those whose exile, imprisonment, or death is acceptable or even important for the survival of the nation. So these structures then are presented as being neutral, and one can be included and granted legal rights, but there are those who cannot be. And this again, for critical race theorists, and specifically for Hartman and others who write about slavery, is tied to the politics of slavery. And so this kind of use, again, of Blackness as being undeserving of rights has justified police brutality and the extrajudicial killing of Black people. So rights are, again, kind of used as those as the kind of rights that protect the imagined innocence of whiteness from the imagined danger of blackness. And obviously, for Hartman, this is again about slavery, that the freedom of Black people does not threaten those who do not believe in slavery and those who do not believe in the ongoing kind of use of slavery as a metaphor to describe people's lives and people's work or relationships to each other. Critical race theorists have supplied the concept of preservation through transformation to describe the neat trick that civil rights law performed in this dynamic. In the face of significant resistance to conditions of subjection, law reform tends to provide just enough transformation to stabilize and preserve status quo conditions. So, an example would be policing and the ways that policing is used to protect the wealthiest people in North America from the poor. And obviously, this will again take us back to slavery. Why are certain people extremely wealthy? And how can the police be then used to protect these very wealthy people from those who are not wealthy? And obviously, for Hartman, the ways that slavery often worked was to always use Blackness to support white wealth and innocence, and to protect white people from criminalization, even after having kidnapped mass numbers of people and enslaved them. Critical race theorists have helped identify the inadequacy of the discrimination principle that is central to the failing of formal legal equality to deliver material relief from racism. The discrimination principle conceptualizes racial harm as individual manifestations of bias in activities like hiring, firing, leasing, selling, or serving. This approach to understanding racism relies on at least two harmful assumptions. First is that race consciousness on the part of both people of color and white people, not intergenerational structures of white supremacy, is the problem that the law must eliminate, leaving color blindness in its place, contributing to the dismantling of programs seeking to address racial disparities such as affirmative action. In the absence of explicit intentional exclusion, courts rarely find a violation of discrimination law. Most Black people who have been denied a job, an apartment, or access to public accommodation cannot provide evidence of intent required, not to mention that most people for whom such losses might produce the worst conditions cannot afford an attorney. So we discussed Judith Butler, and Judith Butler's essay on hate speech talks about the burning of crosses. And the burning of crosses is seen to be an act of free speech in American courts. And for Butler, though, speech is not just something that we do. Someone doesn't just speak blah, blah, blah. Like there is an entire history of terms, of uses of language that predate my use of language. In order for the terms, say, woman and man to make sense in English, we have to have a shared understanding of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man. If I used other terms, like hijra is a term that is used to refer to male to female transgender people in India. But the term hijra is not really a term that we would all understand. So we have to have a common language. And there is a history behind this common language. So when someone burns a cross, what Judith Butler argues is they are not just speaking on their own. They're not just burning a cross as, say, an individual artist who came up with this unique idea. They are speaking as a history of speakers, as a community of speakers who has burned crosses in order to persecute Black people and to try to reinstitute slavery or to try to support the enslavement of Black people or the killing of Black people who are free after slavery. So the second faulty assumption underlying the discrimination principle is that the law itself can remedy the most significant conditions of white supremacy. The broad conditions of extreme racial disparity in access to housing, employment, education, food, and healthcare, and severe disproportionality in criminal punishment, environmental damage, and immigration enforcement are cast as natural and inevitable by the discrimination principle. So the sense that we must all kind of be colorblind in the workplace actually allows for people to just ignore historical atrocities and systemic discrimination. So if I come to work and I have no food after uh, years of British colonialism and then systemic racism, then I just have to work and then I will eventually make money and then I will, I guess, buy food. And so this is fine. But then if I am discriminated against in the workplace and no one wants me to work there because of my skin color or my name, because I'm part of the Indian diaspora and connected to India, a poor country with lots of starving people after British colonial rule, then how do I prove it? How do I prove that these people just don't like me? I can't prove it. So I can go to court and try to prove it, but it's really difficult because they aren't going to necessarily say, we don't like your physical appearance. Um, so I am then left with just this kind of knowledge that people dislike me, but I cannot prove it. And I do know that British colonialism did impoverish many people in India. And I can imagine that many people would prefer to be with those who are more privileged in terms of class and race. But how do I prove this? So the law then does not necessarily offer meaningful forms of remedy for historical atrocities. The law begins with the time of capital in the same way that if someone came to Canada with the Indian national rupee, they are not going to be given the Great British Pound after colonialism. We will have to begin again and try to make the Canadian dollar. And this is how the law works. There is no kind of historical memory. And so the law, this kind of equality principle within the law and discrimination law is not reparations. So Hartman states that care is the antidote to violence. The demands of the slave on the present have everything to do with making good the promise of abolition, and this entails much more than the end of property in slaves. So you will then on the exam, this is an exam review, sorry if it seems like a lecture. You will be asked to then define short answers, you wrote concepts in short answer format. And so you'll be given a list of terms and you will be asked to choose 4 out of 7 terms. So I would familiarize yourself with key terms from the readings, like disidentification and fungibility. Necropolitics is also a term from the reading, and it is Achille Mbembe's essay and book about necropolitics. And Mbembe is a South African scholar who looks at the politics of death and dying. Michel Foucault discussed biopolitics in his 1970s lecture at the Collège de France. And Michel Foucault talked about the ways that the state intervenes into our lives. And so the state puts warnings on cigarette packets. The state puts warnings on alcohol. The state also puts nutritional guidelines and counts on our food. And this is the way that the state is investing in our lives. But for Memembe, colonialism involved divesting from the lives of colonized peoples. So while the European state invests in the life of Europeans, it also does so by simultaneously taking from colonized people. So the essay assumes that the ultimate expression of sovereignty resides to a large degree in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. And so Memembe puts forward this argument regarding necropolitics and necropower to account for the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of living dead. And so Memembe's writing is really strong, and the author is concerned with the ways that the vitality of European life must involve this creating people in the colonies who are the living dead. That European colonialism essentially set up a system where colonizers could live on the backs, off the backs of the colonized. The colonizers could live against the interests of the colonized. So the essay has also outlined some of the repressed topographies of cruelty, the plantation and the colony in particular, and has suggested that under conditions of necropower, the lines between resistance and suicide, sacrifice and redemption, martyrdom and freedom are blurred. So it's a great essay by Achille Memembe. The ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. To kill or let live thus constitutes sovereignty's limits, its principal attributes. To be sovereign is to exert one's control over mortality and to define life as the deployment and manifestation of power. So, a fourth concept is Black feminist standpoint epistemology, and this is from the work of Patricia Hill Collins. So, Sandra Harding is a feminist scholar who used the term standpoint epistemology to critique positivism and scientific reason. And so, for Harding, scientific research or positivist research begins from the idea of omnipotence, a neutral, objective observer who does research without any social location. So there's this kind of objective person who stands at a distance and can count people. So if I was to count, say, how many Indigenous people are in this room, and I would count, and then I would write it down, and then I would produce my study or my findings. Harding argues that we as people are always located in relation to those whom we name or discuss or write about or are in conversation with. So when I speak to you as a certain person, as a person who is a woman, part of the Indian diaspora, born in Canada. I'm a certain age, I have a certain income bracket, I live in a certain place in Toronto, a certain neighborhood, and that is who I am when I speak to you. I am not an objective, omnipotent kind of narrator or a god who can just kind of name you. And this is Harding's critique of sexism within research. And so Sandra Harding would ask us to critique the ways that maleness or men or heterosexuality, patriarchy is often assumed and taken for granted. And from a feminist perspective, a lot of societal problems and questions look differently or look different from the perspective of women. So, childbirth and the family, from a feminist perspective, are very different. Debates regarding housing are obviously really different if you think about rape and the possibility that certain conditions of housing might scare those who think that they are more statistically likely to be raped, like women. So Sandra Harding also provides a useful definition of Eurocentrism. Western or Eurocentric social and political thought contains three interrelated approaches to ascertaining truth that are routinely portrayed as competing epistemologies. So the idea of who tells the truth, who has the right to kind of objectively observe reality, is also connected to colonialism. And so Harding's work has been extremely useful and influential in critical race theory, as well as feminist theory and queer theory. And so Patricia Hill Collins then discusses Black women's standpoint and Black feminist standpoints. No homogeneous Black woman's standpoint exists for Patricia Hill Collins. There is no essential or archetypal Black woman whose experiences stand as normal, normative, and thereby authentic. An essentialist understanding of a Black woman's standpoint suppresses differences among Black women in search of an elusive group unity. Instead, it may be more accurate to say that a Black woman's collective standpoint does exist, one characterized by the tensions that accrue to different responses to common challenges. So Hill Collins then is interested in the ways that Black women's oppositional knowledge is derived from a Black feminist standpoint, and the ways that, say, questions regarding policing look is about one's social location. Our understanding of the police and whether the police will protect us is really about our social location, our lived experience. And so Patricia Hill Collins' book argues that since Black feminist thought both arises within and aims to articulate a Black women's group standpoint regarding experiences associated with intersecting oppressions, stressing this group's standpoint's heterogeneous composition is significant. So Black feminist standpoint then is not about the universalization of all people's experience because of gender or race. It is really about the diversity of Black women's experiences. And it is also about the oppositional knowledge, however, that is created because of the reality of sexism and racism, and because of the specific ways that Black women were oppressed as both Black people and women during slavery and after slavery. So Black feminist thought can be viewed as subjugated knowledge. And we also discussed Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's term epistemic violence. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. And what Spivak argues is that colonialism, European colonialism, did violence or enacted violence against non-European, non-Western systems of knowledge and thought. And so Black feminist thought is also a form of subjugated knowledge, and knowledge that is only produced from the vantage point of, say, white European men, white American men, or white people, enacts epistemic violence against knowledge produced from the lived experiences of Black people and Black women who have an oppositional gaze that exposes the subject position of an unmarked white subject. So we began the class by discussing the case of Cindy Gladue. Cindy Gladue was murdered by Bradley Barton, and in a court of law, Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native girl, or, quote, a native prostitute, over 50 times. Bradley Barton was not referred to as a white man. So when white men speak and when they do things, they are often not named as white men. They're just people living their lives. And again, we can even think about Hartman's argument that when Bradley Barton commits crimes, Cindy Gladue is a quote native prostitute, so he can get away with committing crimes. And so the marking of Gladue's body exonerates Bradley Barton. Bradley Barton is a white man, and he is now a white man who is in jail after being tried at the Supreme Court level. So this oppositional gaze, a Black feminist gaze, then would name this person Bradley Barton as a white man who inserted a knife into an Indigenous woman's vagina, causing her to bleed to death in an Edmonton motel room. And he did this, and the fact that he is a white man is also about the history of colonialism and the history of settler colonialism in Canada. I mean, the history of settler colonialism is really about also money and power, that European men were actually given money and land to come to Canada and to settle the land. And they were instructed to clear the land. And modern Canadian law prevents people from using their historically constituted racial or caste-based privileges to do harm to others, to steal from others, to kill others. So we finished the class then by discussing people with disabilities. The scholarship of people with disabilities in the article from the syllabus looks at colonialism and the ways that decolonization can intersect with the theories of disability. So aiming to contribute to the ongoing development of decolonial disability theory, we offer 3 points of theoretical and practical convergence through which to consider a recent and widely known manifestation of Native resistance to settler colonialism, the Standing Rock resistance against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which we read as a struggle for disability justice. So disability justice then is not only about the rights of people with disabilities. It is also about money and the ways that the state allocates money and resources to certain projects, as opposed to others. So queer people of color is also a term that we've discussed in looking at Jose Munoz's work, Disidentification, Queers of Color in the Politics of Performance. And Munoz discusses the ways that queer people of color often struggle against multiple forms of oppression. And in discussing queer people of color, or if you discuss queer people of color in your exam, you can also think about intersectionality and the ways that race and gender and sexuality and class intersect. And Jose Munoz also discusses the way that gay and lesbian history does not have one single lineage or narrative. We speak of gay and lesbian history as if there is one single narrative for all lesbians and all gay men, and if that narrative has coherence and unfolds in terms of exclusion and marginalization, followed by protest and revolts that then resolves in terms of accommodation and assimilation. And Munoz discusses very different histories and lines for people of different classes, people of different racial groups, and people of different genders. So there is no one gay and lesbian and transgender history. Gay male history does not line up nicely with lesbian history. Black histories of sexuality look very different from white ones. Histories involving queer people who emigrate from one region to another look massively different from histories of people who spend their whole lives in one area, one city, one neighborhood event. This disidentification for the minority subject is a mode of recycling or reforming an object that has already been invested with powerful energy. So another term we discussed was homo sacer and femina. And in the essay by Ronit Linton, the author discusses Savita Halappanavar. Savita Halappanavar's death shocked Irish society. And the argument goes beyond one that just looks at Halappanavar's death from a gender-centric position. So for Lenton, Halappanavar was not only a woman who could not have an abortion, she was a woman of color and a migrant from India. So in the essay, Lenton draws on Giorgio Agamben's concept homo sacer to discuss the feminist sacer, the woman who can be sacrificed by state power. And Lenton argues that the Irish state can engage in nation building by allowing the sovereign power to exclude and even to kill non-white and non-Catholic women migrants using these policies regarding abortion, which are essentially also which essentially also involves the use of stringent patriarchal religious norms to deny women abortions, and in this case, to kill women. The birthing and reproductive functions of women in Ireland have always been policed, controlled, and abused. The racial state is also a state of exception where some populations are cast as what Agamben calls bare life or homo sacer, at the mercy of sovereign power. So section 2 of the exam is going to be an essay. And so the first section, I've just gone over some short concepts or some concepts that you could think about for the exam. There are other concepts we've also discussed from the readings. And I would ask you to review the readings. And in your review or in studying or preparing for the exam, you can bring notes. And I would encourage you to take notes regarding concepts, key concepts from the reading. The second part of the exam will be an essay, and you will be asked to choose one of the following questions to answer in essay format. And you are asked to construct an original thesis and use your own voice as a critic and scholar to make an original argument. Try to make reference to readings from the syllabus. You can also discuss your personal experiences and opinions. And the essay will be marked out of 10. So the essay will ask you to formulate an original thesis about a theme from the class or a question that the class has posed. So some of the key themes we've discussed have been about beauty, race, and racism. And we looked at essays regarding constructions of beauty and the relationship between beauty and colonialism, slavery, and class. Abortion, the banning of abortion in Ireland. We talked about debates regarding racism and abortion in the United States of America, and the ways that the Dobbs ruling, which overturned the Roe versus Wade precedent in the United States of America, will disproportionately affect Indigenous Black women and women of color. We've discussed intersectionality repeatedly throughout the course, and we've discussed intersectionality, Black feminism, and anti-racist feminism. And finally, we've talked about queer people of color and transgender people of color and disidentifications. So you will be asked then to write one essay. regarding one theme from the class. And you are asked to formulate your own original thesis about a theme from the class. And you can write in first person and draw on your own personal experiences. You are also asked to make reference to the course readings in the essay and in the short answer components. So I'll go back to the beginning. And again, I'll just go over this, that the exam will be in two sections, a short answer, which will be 20 marks, and you are asked to define 4 out of 7 concepts. And then the second section will look like this, and there will be an essay. You are asked to answer an essay question and to make your own original thesis and make reference to readings. You can bring notes with you into the exam hall. I hope that you do well. I hope that you enjoyed the class so far. I hope that you have enjoyed the lectures, the recorded lectures. And that's all. Please feel free to contact me with any questions. If you would like to hand in late assignments, please send them to my university email. And also, please feel free to contact me if you would like a letter of reference for future law school applications or graduate school applications or employment applications. And I guess that is all. I hope this was enough of a review, and I wish you the best in the exam. I hope that you do very, very well and enjoy the rest of the summer. Thank you very much for your participation in the class. Okay, bye. Have a fun summer.